I will try and lay out my questions and sort of where I'm starting from. Saying that I believe in the need for new cadet classes, both from the perspective of maintaining appropriate staffing levels and from the understanding that to change the culture and environment of law enforcement, we need new perspectives, new experiences, and new people at APD. I'm also, though, committed to the transformations and reforms coming from the reimagining public safety process and from the stuff we had in works before that. I have to admit, I'm really having a hard time understanding item 37. And I'm hearing varying interpretations of what this item actually does and how it is going to be implemented. And it's just not clear to me what this blueprint means. It's not clear to me how passage of this blueprint ensures the implementation of the Kroll recommendations and other reports recommendations. We don't have the final recommendations and review from Kroll. And I'm concerned that we're passing this before we have the final report. And I also just want to know what the accountability levers and action requirements are within this blueprint and the Academy revision process. So I have several questions that I'd like to ask to help me to understand it, because it may all be in here. It's a different format than we usually use for things. And it's a very important subject, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding clearly what I'm voting on. So to start, does this item approve the initiation of the 144th cadet class? And that is, what if the standards aren't met and the short-term recommendations from Kroll are not implemented before the class starts?
Then the class won't start, Councilmember. I mean, essentially, as the resolution states, this resolution would allow us to commence with the first reimagined cadet academy, so long as that academy can be conducted in accord with the objectives in that blueprint. And so we're setting out the path of how we can have this class start, but by approving the blueprint, you agree with what we are saying will be part of that transformational process. And in terms of the accountability, we maintain to have Kroll and their team ensuring that there is that audit as these things are continuing to move along. We also will be providing regular updates to council in the following weeks and months before any class would start, to make sure that all of the recommendations would be implemented. I'll ask if ACM Ariana wants to add anything, but I also know having our Office of Police Oversight Director, Farrah Muscadin, who is actually teaching a class at the University of Texas right now, so couldn't be with us, but she is taking an active oversight role as well. ACM Ariana.
Thank you, City Manager. Again, Ray Ariano, Assistant City Manager of the Safety Outcome Departments. The one thing I would add is one of the things that the City Manager has added in terms of the assurances that we can put in place is engaging with an expanded scope of contract with Joyce James, who has been working with the police department, and as well is going to be in a position to help put that equity broadly on our reimagining public safety effort. And more specifically, there are items within the contract that will help us monitor that recommendations that are being outlined in the blueprint are put in place. And so there are more specifics around that clearly, and we'd be happy to spend some time between now and Thursday to go into more detail with the council member on those aspects.
I appreciate that, and we can try and find some time. I just think the public is, I'm just hearing so many different interpretations of what we're doing. And you know, what you're laying out is along the lines of what I would be comfortable with, but it's not clear from what we're voting on that that's what's happening. So I think it's really important that we establish some of this in public, and we can try and put some of our questions in written form as well, you know, so that we can clarify that and formulate some things. This is just not a format that we usually use, and so it's confusing. How do we ensure that if the standards aren't met and the short-term recommendations are not implemented, that the class doesn't start? And who's making the decision whether the standards have been met?
Again, Councilmember, thanks for this. You know, both through the feedback from our third-party evaluator, through Kroll Associates, through this additional work that our consultant Joyce James will be doing, we would be having that recommendation come up to city management on if the recommendations have been approved or not, or have been implemented or not implemented. in that process, as we're committing to, we would be providing updates to council. So you would be aware of if we were comfortable moving forward or not moving forward based on what have been done. But I will also say there is another checkpoint in a budget amendment that would be coming if at the appropriate time, as long as we're still on this path, on the blueprint, following all the recommendations, we would still need to come to council for approval of those funds that would be needed to have the class start. Ray,
Thank you.
anything? No, okay.
No, nothing additional on that.
Okay, and then, so there's the short-term and there's the long-term recommendations in the Kroll report. So following the community review and the independent evaluators review of the 144th class, assuming it went forward, what then are the accountability levers to ensure that change continues to happen at the academy? So there's a certain amount of faith that goes into starting this academy that says we believe we've made enough progress. We believe we have to get started in order to get moving to address issues in the city, but also even to change the academy, we have to explore and try some things out. So how do we ensure that accountability for the longer term stuff, and how do we ensure that those post-class reviews don't just end up getting shelved?
Yeah, thanks for that, council member. I think as an initial step, having the council hear what those reviews and evaluation of that class was, and then the recommended steps for what additional changes would be needed moving forward, and the progress that the department has been making on the longer term implementations, so you would have insights into all of those areas.
Okay, so there'd be a touch base with council at some point on that, and we have to approve in the budget, I guess, the next class.
Right, and again, we want to make sure that you are aware of the progress that has been made, that we are working on in the future, and the feedback that we received on the way in which this initial class was conducted.
Okay, and what new information are we expected in the final Kroll report? There was already a lot of stuff in the preliminary. What are we expecting in the final Kroll report in terms of larger buckets that we haven't seen already? And what information is Kroll waiting to receive from APD to finalize the report? And what is the timeline for that report to come to council?
I'm going to ask our colleagues at APD to help provide some specifics, but I think part of it was just the robust discussion that we had here at work session a couple weeks ago, and they wanted to make sure that they were incorporating some of the questions and feedback that council had about other things that if they weren't already addressed in their analysis, that they were able to do so. But I'll see if it looks like AC Gay is on the line if he wants to chime in on any additional things that we're waiting for that Kroll is expecting.
Thank you, City Manager and Council. Troy Gay, Chief of Staff with the Austin Police Department. I am unaware of anything that they are waiting on receiving the data, although I do know that they are still conducting some interviews. I do know that they are meeting with Dr. Kringen, who is actually on this call here to help answer any questions. This is her first week, and we're so excited to have her on board. I know they sent her a list of items that they want to talk to her about, so she might be able to provide some additional items that they're needing. Ann?
Hi, yes, Ann Kringen. I'm the division manager from the training for Austin Police Department. So as Chief mentioned, that is true, that I've been talking to Kroll, and basically what they want is to ensure that those initial recommendations we're actually putting into place, right? And so we're demonstrating through the blueprint what we've already done and what we're doing to actually put those in place. In terms of background, I'm a policing scholar. However, I'm a feminist criminologist as well. So I sort of applaud Austin Police Department for the willingness to hire a critical lens to be inside the department. And so a lot of the things that have come up in the Kroll reports and the various other reports are things that I'm familiar with in policing literature. And we know that we have to think about ways to change the police training. However, this is a national discussion, so we're trying to make sure that what we're doing is evidence-based, that we're doing those measures. So the concerns that you have are absolutely valid, and we need to build those measures out and be able to report back. And so we see this as a transparent process. I know that maybe it hasn't been historically, but it's something that we are looking forward to moving forward to. I've been able to talk to a lot of the staff there, and they understand, you know, the recommendations from Kroll. And really, the question I get is, how do we do this? So we're taking on this giant amount of work, but we're looking forward to it, and we expect to be transparent the whole way through.
And council member, the report is expected at the end of the month.
End of March?
Yes.
Thank you and welcome
Thanks.
to Austin, or City of Austin, or Austin if you're new to Austin. I appreciate hearing from you. City Manager, you mentioned that we would be having a budget amendment. Do we have an identified source for the next Cadet Academy, or and a sense of how much that will cost?
The short answer, Councilmember, is yes, and I know that was submitted as a budget or Q&A, and I believe that has been submitted and published, but I'm going to ask Diane, who I believe authored that response, to provide the specifics if she's still on the line.
I am still on the line. So yes, we have identified the funding source. We had $6 million set aside in the general fund to provide supplemental retirement funding to our COERs and our APRS plans. And so the changes that we had planned on implementing didn't go into effect as quickly as we thought, so we had money left over. The academy cost is expected to be $2.2 million, I believe, and so we're going to just utilize that funding for it. And because we had included that supplemental retirement in an ongoing basis, we have the funding to then fund the rest of the academy that goes over into FY22 as well.
Thank you. And then the blueprint, this might be for Dr. Cregan, I think was your name. The blueprint doesn't seem to touch on changes to the paramilitary culture. And that was something that had raised issues across multiple reports. And I see information about adopting adult learning theory components, but I don't see a focus on the underlying paramilitary culture and trying to change that. Can you speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. So we've already discussed with Kroll, one of the recommendations is to separate physical fitness from academics. So there will no longer be a sort of behavioral modification, is what it was previously called, in terms of within classroom, and that physical fitness will be related to the types of things that they would need to do for this job performance, right? So we're making sure that that's very carefully aligned when they do PT, that it will actually align to the tests that they will be performing in physical fitness. So, you know, in terms of revamping, you're right, that is something that I'm working on, is making sure that the instructional manuals and the cadet manuals realign to the new environment, right? And so that we're incorporating that the expectations for the instructors, or the faculty, as we're going to call them, will be aligned with this reimagine that we're moving towards.
Thank you. I think that's a subject we could have a much longer
Yeah.
conversation. And my last question is that I'd like to better understand the process and the timeline for replacing the outdated curriculum. What level of curriculum review and revision is expected to take place, I guess, by you and your committee before a June class starts?
Sure. Great question. So I'm sure you're aware that a lot of the coursework is TCOL mandated, right? So we are making sure that we're hitting the targets so that the cadets can actually pass the end test. So that's sort of a first thing that we're concerned about. However, that's not the overarching goal, as I'm sure you can imagine. So what I've proposed is doing a stratified sample among the departments so that we're not overburdening just the department on communication or culture, to have the academic review committee, which we're forming, which I believe is slated to hopefully come together by the end of the month. I'm talking to individuals who are interested right now to make sure that we have a community representation and academic representation, and then a sworn representation to make sure that we can put the content in perspective with why we're choosing necessarily to teach it within that manner. And so the stratified sample is how we would actually be having it formally reviewed through the public lens, as well as I'm going through, me personally, I'm going through obviously all of the curriculum to ensure before the academy starts, to ensure that we understand DEI. We've already been talking to the Learn Skills unit about incorporating more Spanish in everything that they do, so that we can have discussions throughout the academy class about they're serving Austin, right? And what is the community of Austin like? And so, you know, I think as this unfolds, we'll be able to give more concrete examples of how we're doing it. But I myself am going through all of their curriculum, and then we're working through the more formal process to make sure that it's a stratified sample, and eventually everything will be done. I've been very transparent that we are not trying to tackle all of the curriculum through a formal process of public prior to the June 7th start. There are a lot of departments right now that are revamping their curriculum, including Baltimore Police Department, and they've probably spent about 18 months to have 8 classes open to public, right? I by no means think that that's going to be our timeline, but I do believe that to do this and to do it well, we need to take the time, and we need to also make sure that we're not just making symbolic gestures to the community, that our curriculum is very good, and that we're willing to take the feedback from our committee and incorporate it and demonstrate to them that we are incorporating it.
Thank you. I appreciate the clarifications. I'll submit the questions so that we can have things in writing for folks to review. I will likely be adding some of these responses as clarification to the document. I have to figure out and understand how one does that given the format of the document, and I will try and post those as soon as I have them, but it may take a little while given the format to make it make sense. So I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate the indulgence of going after 5 from my colleagues.